Black History Month you find
ridiculous.
Why?
You're going to relegate my history to a month?
Oh, come on.
What do you do with yours? Which month is White History Month? No, come on, tell me.
Well, I'm Jewish.
Okay, which month is Jewish History Month?
There isn't one.
Oh, why not?
Yeah.
You want one?
No.
I don't either. I don't want a Black History Month. Black history is American history.
Now that we know we've always been here, what do we do now? How do we get the world to believe us? Does it even matter if anyone else does? How could we accept living in a world where our children are taught lies? A wise man once said, "The truth is eternally kept, and a lie dies with the wicked." We could expose every lie in the world, and people still wouldn't believe, because the truth is a weapon for those who live lies. Our ancestors lived those lies, and we continue to do so as we suffer the same iniquities of our predecessors, leading us into generations of slavery, idolatry, and confusion, to the point we wander our homeland aimlessly searching for purpose, all while thinking we were shipped across the world. That psychological mind control is by design. The purpose is to mentally condition Black Americans into a perpetual state of second-class citizenship through psychological and social reconstruction. This method sought to disenfranchise Black Indians from their homeland through the establishment of laws and codes written into the inner processes of government operations. These new laws manifested themselves in a way that would systematically engineer the social classification of Indians unto this day. The concept of land ownership was something new to these people. Through disease, the sword, and the gun, these rules were imposed. The term Negro became synonymous with Black and African, neither of which is true, but both necessary for the total destruction of a people's history. Why did it take over 50 years of African slavery before Virginia enacted the Virginia Slave Codes, or the Virginia Slave Act of 1682? Why was it important to categorize Black Indians and African slaves into one single category when there had been no such previous classification? Then why was it lawful for any Negro caught without the proper paperwork to be kidnapped into slavery. Slavery in the Americas was harsh, brutal, and most importantly, lasted a lifetime. And now, under new slave laws, a crew of Europeans armed with rabid dogs and guns can legally kill and rape themselves into a fortune. Just ask any conquistador. Slavery was a necessary tool for Europeans to establish themselves in the new old world, without which they would not have surely survived. Completely unprepared for the wilderness, the same heathens responsible for the murder of millions were at one time themselves on the brink of death and desperate for survival. It was the natives who consistently bailed out these conquistadors whenever they were in trouble. These conquistadors were presented with lavish gifts and treated like kings until at some point they wore out their welcome. And then, depending on their situation or desperation, they would move on to the next destination or pull a surprise murder hijack at a night festival and pack the boat full of Indians for a rape cruise back across the treacherous Atlantic, where the unlucky survivors were sold into slavery. In 1452, Pope Nicholas V issued a papal bull. It authorized Alfonso of Portugal to conquer all Saracens, pagans, and non-Christians and deliver them into perpetual servitude. In 1469, Queen Isabella of Castile and King Ferdinand of House Aragon got married. This is the most important wedding in Spanish history, and possibly world history. It is generally mentioned that this marriage initiates the unification of Spain. In 1491, the battle at Granada officially ended Moorish rule in Spain. The families of those Muslims were driven out. The Treaty of Granada was signed on November 25th, 1491, between Boabdil the Sultan and Isabella and King Ferdinand. In 1492, the Queen and King of Castile, Ferdinand and Isabella, the King and Queen authorized and financed Christopher Columbus's first voyage to the Americas, in which he was given the responsibility to sail west and claim land for Spain. Scholars have asserted for centuries that this voyage west for the first time, brought knowledge of the existence of the Americas, in which the Europeans had no prior knowledge of. This idea is a completely false narrative. The Americas were well known and had been trading with other areas of the world since the dawn of civilization. Ironically enough, in 1493, Pope Alexander signed Inter Caetera, in which all lands to the west and south of the Cape Verde Islands were under the control of Portugal and Spain. And this would be the reason that the majority of Mexico, Central, and South America all either speak Spanish or Portuguese. In 1494, these lands were officially divided into conquest borders during the signing of the Treaty of Tordesillas. During the conquering colonization of these people in the Americas, the Spanish initiated their own system of slave labor called encomienda. Kings would reward individuals with their own group of slaves offered from the conquered communities. Captives of conquest were forced into perpetual servitude. By 1520, hundreds of conquistadors had been sent to the Americas by the House of Castile and Portugal. By 1521, the Spaniards, along with Cortez and smallpox, had laid siege to the Aztec Empire. By 1532, a slew of Pizarros and smallpox had began the destruction of the Incan Empire in Peru. As well, by 1525, the Mayans and the Yucatan region had been well penetrated, but yet to be completely conquered. This distinct era between 1492 and 1532 marked the begin of Spanish domination in the Americas for over 300 years. What spiritual naivete did these natives have so they could not see what was coming? These people possessed a spirit of kindness and innocence never before experienced by Europeans. Even Columbus remarked about the unbelievable hospitality and graciousness of these Indians. And although these people were non-violent, they had fearsome warriors amongst their ranks extensively trained in the ways of wars. But they had themselves never seen a gun and thought of guns as sticks that shot fire. To the natives, guns were magic. But it would not be long after trade was initiated with Europeans that Indians themselves would become experts at flintlock muskets. As I mentioned earlier, a common tactic of the conquistador was to ambush a village, usually at night during a ceremony. But even before getting to that point, they usually took a slave interpreter who could speak the native language. This itself puts a young person in the unenviable position of being a traitor to their own people. When Hernan Cortez took Malinche, she was just a girl, but essentially, she was a major proponent in helping the Spaniards overthrow Montezuma and the Aztec Empire. A girl was able to provide the intelligence necessary for an entire kingdom to fall. Malinche had a child with Cortez, and she is often referred to as the mother of the Mexican race. The seed of an indigenous woman and a Spaniard is the ethno-makeup of a modern-day Mexican, although all modern depictions of Malinche do not depict an indigenous woman. In fact, she is depicted with Euro-Asian features as highlighted in several works of art. But we know for a fact that she was an indigenous woman. A woman indigenous to a land that never before had seen Europeans. Spaniards basically raped as soon as they landed and raped as many women as possible, often having competitions to see who could rape the most women in one village. Her and Cortez had a son named Martin. He is considered one of the first mestizos, a people of mixed indigenous and European ancestry. Over the years, she would learn Spanish and use her native tongue to translate important meetings and became an invaluable asset in the development of Spaniard objectives. The pure scope of her importance to Cortez cannot be overstated. Without Malinche, Cortez could not have accomplished his purposes. Her diplomatic skills had become well accomplished and garnered a position of respect amongst some of the most powerful men in the land, including but not limited to great chiefs like Montezuma and soldiers in the Spanish army.
Agrega Bernal que algunas calles estaban tapiadas, en las azoteas habían acumulado piedras hombres, dice vi mujeres y niños. Parece que las gentes de Cholula nos preparan una emboscada. La anciana le ha dicho que moriríamos todos.
Rodriguez de Acana makes the definite assertion that after God, Malinche is the main reason behind Cortez's success. It is recounted that one of her greatest skills was to convince Indian tribes to stand down against the Spaniards because they were no match for men on horseback with metal swords and guns. Respected as a noblewoman, her manner of speech was considered intelligent, truthful, and well-informed. Yet she yielded her heart, lifelong hard work, and intelligence to a man who sought to exterminate her homeland. A slave girl who had been given away as property. Maybe there wasn't much for her to love about home. Maybe she took joy in laying with Cortez the killer. An indigenous woman remembered as a Spanish hero, and quite possibly the greatest conquistador in Mexican history. In the 1530s, Jacques Cartier and the French had begun exploring the St. Lawrence River, the Great Lakes region, and into the interior of mainland America. Down the Mississippi, the French would go on to settle in what's known today as Quebec, Montreal, Detroit, Green Bay, St. Louis, Biloxi, Baton Rouge, and New Orleans.
But this is a very special day simply because I get to really be intimate with a lot of individuals that I haven't necessarily met face to face all of yet. But the fact that the support has been there, even without necessarily knowing each other, shows how special and what it means to be a native of this country and be a Native American. And for me, I had no idea. I had no idea about the history. I had no idea how inclusive this group is and what it means to be part of Standing Rock and be part of the United Sioux Nation. So I want to thank all you guys for hosting myself, my sister, my best friend Brett Carroll, my grandparents, and the fact that I get to meet my family finally. I mean, you guys have no idea. This is finally meeting my mom's family, and now I'm with you guys forever, and I hope that you don't mind that, because I don't mind it either. So.
A number of things one will often hear when making the statement, "I'm a full-blooded Indian." Usually the opposition will counter with the response, "Prove it." When this opposition wants a person to prove Native American ancestry, they are almost always referring to DNA testing and never referring to actual bloodlines through birth records, which is the only true method of discovering a person's real ancestry. When a person says, "I've done a DNA test and actually traced my roots to several countries in Africa, therefore this proves I'm from Africa," well, actually, no, it doesn't. You have just fallen victim to an antiquated and purposely deceptive manipulation tactic. When a person submits their information for a DNA test, people don't truly understand what they are really getting. Some think these tests actually prove that their families came from Africa, but it doesn't. It only proves that some percentage of West Africans, along with the majority of Black Americans, have similar genetics. This literally proves nothing more than relationship. It does not prove ancestry, which can only be proven through birth.
As far when it comes down to genetics, he says, we don't know the answer to this, not at this point. That was in 2002. I submit that President Hinckley is a prophet of God, because 1 year later, articles started to come out in scientific peer-reviewed genetics journals that talked about a new founding lineage. These were these forward lineages. They found a new founding lineage, which was primarily found among the Algonquin-speaking language groups of North American Indians. And they were indicated by 5 specific markers in their DNA that differentiate them from the other 4. And when they went looking for these 5 markers in other populations around the earth, guess where they found them? They were in the Druze population of Israel. They found that they were, later on, additional research found that they were in the Ashkenazi Jews population, which is the largest population of Jews on the planet. It's in the Sephardic Jews, the Libyan Jews, the Moroccan Jews, the Tunisian Jews. All of these diverse Jewish populations around the world have these 5 markers, which are also found in the Algonquin-speaking language groups, which is about 110 Native American tribes in North America. For example, the Sioux and the Cheyenne and the Blackfoot, the Cherokee, the Iroquois, the Ojibwe, the Sac and the Fox, Potawatomi, the Penobscot. All of these tribes, and mostly concentrated in the Great Lakes region of the United States and Canada, is where they find these 5 markers and these people.
These DNA tests categorize people into haplogroups based on similarities in genetics. When a Black American receives a test that almost always points to the west coast of Africa, they are doing so under the false narrative that the entire world's population descended from Africa. The reason for this is Charles Darwin and the theory of evolution, which has been academically accepted throughout the world of education, but has yet to be proven. In fact, all archaeological evidence confirms that the Americas are home to the world's oldest art, civilization, and most importantly, languages. These haplogroups, of course, fall directly in line with the evolutionary theory. There is one major problem, however. These groups have genetic variables that can be back engineered to prove genetic similarities between currently existing groups of people. And yes, they have been done, and the results show that the oldest population of people on Earth are here in America, but a very small percentage of so-called paper-backed Native Americans have this ancient DNA. In fact, the so-called Jews from the Middle East and Europe have none of this DNA. In fact, the world's oldest genes strictly predominate the lands of the Americas and are nowhere to be found on the continents of Europe and Asia. In 1585, the English established their first settlement on Roanoke Island in North Carolina. This attempt at settlement was funded by Sir Walter Raleigh, for whom the capital city is currently named after, although Raleigh himself never stepped foot in the colony. Raleigh instead would sail to South America in search of the mysterious city of gold, El Dorado. And just like his colony in North Carolina, Raleigh was unsuccessful. On Roanoke Island in Dare County, North Carolina, Raleigh's colony was in a struggle to maintain. Bad blood with the local Indians and the inability to establish trade and acquire the necessary supplies for survival caused some members to return in just a year. John White was an artist who traveled back to North Carolina on the return expedition, only to find a fraction of the people remaining. Again, he returned to England for supplies and provisions, but was unable to sail back to Roanoke due to the Anglo-Spanish War. He was held from returning until 1590 due to a dramatic series of unlucky events, but he finally made it back on August 18th, 1590. His granddaughter Virginia's third birthday. Virginia Dare was the first full-blooded English child born in America. When White finally made it back to Roanoke Island, the colony had been abandoned and left in shambles. There were no survivors. The only one of a few remaining clues was the word Croatoan, carved into a post on a fort. Croatoan was the name of the Indian tribe that inhabited North Carolina's predominant barrier island, Hatteras. White was unable to find his daughter or his granddaughter Virginia, neither the children, men, and women of the colony, whom had numbered over 100 people. There is a consensus among historians that either one or two things happened. First, they were taken in by a local friendly tribe in which they were never located, or they were simply massacred and exterminated. Less than 2 decades later, in 1607, the English would establish their first successful colony in Virginia, Jamestown. And with Jamestown began African slave trade to America.
Is made up of 606 feet, 606 feet, 606 feet, 606 feet. 606. It's made up of stades, exactly the same. Now, if that's not interesting enough, look at the angle of the Great Pyramid of Giza. If you take the angle of the Great Pyramid of Giza, the slope is 51.8 degrees. Let's go back to the earthworks. If you measure the line that goes straight through the center of the structure, right here, and then you go true north, it's 51.8 degrees. That angle is exactly the same angle as the pyramids of Giza. It is the same math, the same calculations as ancient Egyptians. Let me show you one more connection. In 1860, David Wyrick, he's a guy who surveyed the Newark earthworks. He was digging into a mound near those earthworks, and he found a wooden coffin made of oak. They opened up the coffin and found a skeleton of a man holding a little box that was about 8.10 inches in size. The box had been cemented shut here. This, by the way, is sitting in Ohio. Well, he opened up the box and he found a little man inside, a little black stone. They took it to scholars, and they looked at it. The man seems to be carrying something, and there's writing here. At first, they couldn't recognize. The writing is, they thought in 1860, some sort of Hebrew. Well, finally, about 20 years later, they found some rabbis living in the area, and the rabbis looked at that, and they could read it. They said it was an old kind of block Hebrew, and it was a rendition of the 10 Commandments. Now, this is another piece. Block Hebrew. They said they'd never seen anything like it. Mainstream archaeologists at the time called this a hoax. But then in 1900, or just about after 1900, in Israel, they found the same block-style Hebrew writing. Mainstream archaeologists still dismiss the findings. They found it in Israel, and they found it in Ohio. But there was another stone that they found that they couldn't argue. This is the Bat Creek stone. It was found during the course of an official Smithsonian evacuation. The Smithsonian didn't understand the meaning of the writing on the stone. They thought it was Cherokee, since it came from Cherokee country. They didn't realize that it's actually Hebrew. They had published this originally upside down. They threw it in a box at the bottom of the Smithsonian, put it in the basement.
What takes us 6 hours today by plane was then a voyage of more than 2 months. 7 of the early adventurers out of every 10 will be dead within a year. But the risks are worth it. North America is the ultimate land of opportunity. A continent of vast, untapped wealth. Starting with the most valuable resource of all, land. They built Jamestown in the middle of a Native American empire. 60 starving settlers among 20,000 of the Powhatan Nation. Armed with bows and arrows, they're up to 9 times faster to reload and fire than an English musket. Soon enemies.
The British had not as easily conquered the natives of this land as the Spanish before them had. The nations of the mainland continent of North America had not been as overly hospitable as their neighbors to the south. And Jamestown faced a myriad of attacks from local tribes in its course to establish itself in the New Old World. By 1619, the African slave trade had fully become integrated into the Virginia economy. It is important to note that the entire colonized territory is known as Virginia. In 1640, Virginia law states, all persons except Africans will be provided with arms and ammunition. In 1660, the term Negro slave appears in law and is recognized as an inherited condition from child to mother. In 1669, slaves can legally be murdered for disobeying their masters. The Treaty of 1677, this treaty designated those who signed it as tributary tribes, meaning they were guaranteed homeland rights to the land as well as the right to bear arms as long as these nations remained subjects under English rule. The 1682 Virginia Slave Act combined the legal status of Indians and African slaves into the same category. From this point forward, any native is now considered a slave, especially any native caught within the borders of Virginia territory. The Virginia Codes of 1705 were laws that further pushed the doctrine of white supremacy. These laws were initiated to give whites complete property control over the increasing slave population. As a result of the African slave trade, free black Indians were pushed out of their homelands and aggressively hunted for capture into slavery. These laws articulated no distinction between Indians born in America and Africans. By the mid-1700s, the Jamestown, Virginia economy was booming, and the reason for that was the land's #1 cash crop in Europe, tobacco. Free labor from African and captured Indian slaves provided an opportunity for prosperity for Europeans in this new world, even for the poorest whites who sold themselves into indentured servitude for a chance to make it in America. They would serve their masters for a span of time, usually on average a few years, and were given freedom as a stipend of time served. Even blacks, both African and Indian, could buy their freedom, although they could no longer employ white servants as they once could. Although white supremacy was law, those who were considered Negro could still purchase autonomy. In May 1754, soldiers under the leadership of George Washington, then only 22 years old, ambushed a French patrol who at the time was in control of the strategic area of Pittsburgh along the confluence of the Allegheny and Monongahela rivers. The site of Fort Duquesne. Contrary to what a person ignorant of the history may think, the French-Indian War wasn't just fought between the French against the Indians in a classical sense. The war was between the French and the British, in which both sides enlisted the help of Indian tribes who signed treaties for homeland rights that, of course, were never honored. The French had demolished a British fort and built Fort Duquesne, after which the British later captured it back. The importance of this location was due to the fact that it was located within the Mississippi River drainage basin. This location was important because it was navigable by boat down the river from Canada through St. Louis to New Orleans and the Gulf of Mexico. During the American Revolution, the French actually allied the 13 colonies against the British.
Order! December 16th, 1773. One of the most important dates in the history of the United States, the Boston Tea Party.
For we will not pay that tax.
The day the colonists took a dramatic stand against British rule. It's the event that sparked the American Revolution, and a day that deserves to be honored every year by every American. On this fateful night, Samuel Adams and the Sons of Liberty dumped more than 300 crates of tea into the harbor. It was their patriotism that led to the freedom of each and every one of us.
The conflict between the king and the colonies would finally hit a boiling point over money and resources, mainly taxes being paid by the colonies as tribute to the king. They rejected the authority of the British Parliament because they had no representatives in that governing body. Their position: no taxation without representation. Did you know that large groups of American Indians moved and settled into colonies in Africa over 200 years ago? As early as 1791, the British had begun setting up colonies in Sierra Leone and Liberia. And settled tens of thousands of displaced blacks during the 1800s. This means that even more American Indians were being brought across the Atlantic to Africa in 1822. The American Colonization Society precipitated the events that brought free and formerly enslaved blacks to Africa for supposed liberation. This wasn't the first Back to Africa movement. This was the first To Africa movement. The new American Indian Liberians didn't enter African territory receiving the same hospitality in which the Europeans had received when first stepping into America. Wasn't this supposed to be a homecoming? It wouldn't be long until these new Africans started pushing one of the most destructive weapons in the history of the world. Christianity. Paul Cuffey is said to have participated in the colonialization of Sierra Leone. It is also stated that Cuffey himself is of mixed ancestry. His father captured at a young age and shipped into slavery in America. His owner, being Quaker, could no longer morally support the institution of slavery and Cuffy's father was set free. Afterwards, he married his mother, who was a member of Wampanoag Nation. Cuffy is quite possibly one of the first mixed Native American and Africans to gain prosperity in America. Cuffy's father, after being freed, owned a 116-acre farm and his home, in which Cuffy inherited after his death. By the age of 24, Cuffy was beginning to establish a shipping empire, owning a fleet of ships in which he ran trade enterprises up and down the Atlantic coast, the Caribbean, and even Europe. By 1800, Paul Cuffy was the richest African Indian American in the country. Due to the discrimination and racism endured by blacks in this country, Cuffy decided that people of color would only achieve equality if they moved to Africa. He was one of the first black Americans to embrace this idea. This would eventually be known as the Back to Africa movement, although Cuffy himself was only half African and half American Indian.
In April 1980, a tragedy unfolded in my country, the small West African nation of Liberia. People had come to celebrate a military coup against their government and the cold-blooded murder of their president. They watched as 13 former cabinet members were stripped, tied to poles, and executed. It was hard to believe in that moment that Liberia was Africa's oldest republic, founded 133 years before on the promise of peace and freedom for the American blacks who settled here during a time of slavery. Now the peace had ended, and there was worse, much worse to come.
These populations composed of Indians who were either free or formerly enslaved. It's important to note that the American Colonial Society presidents were politicians. The first president was nephew of George Washington and a member of the Supreme Court, Bushrod Washington. Other members of the American Colonial Society included large slaveholders like Henry Clay from Kentucky. American Indians would begin admixing with the native African population at least as early as 1790, but not in the way that you may think. In 1860, the population of slaves in the U.S. reached over 4 million. But this is 50 years after the Slave Trade Act of 1808, which abolished the slave trade in North America. Between 1808 and 1860, we know that a large area of black Indians in the South were pushed out of their ancestral homelands by Andrew Jackson and the military. That was less than 200 years ago. It would literally be impossible for that amount to have come from Africa, considering in 367 years, less than 400,000 made it to North America, which is only 1/10 of that overall 4 million slave number. This is according to the Transatlantic Slave Trade Database. So even the accepted academic narrative has flaws in its theory. The idea that black slaves were multiplying in great numbers instead of dying in great numbers is an asinine assertion. Slavery was cruel and brutal, and most women couldn't even conceive, and the average life expectancy was 24 years old. Slaves were considered property. There was no maternity leave. So the idea that these overworked and overstressed women were dropping babies left and right is foolishly and disrespectfully ignorant. After America gained its supposed independence, President Andrew Jackson took an even more aggressive approach to the extermination of Indians with the Indian Removal Act of 1830. By now, the African slave trade overseas had ended after the Slave Trade Act of 1808. But slavery in the South was still a quickly expanding business. But these slaves weren't African. In fact, there had been hundreds of different tribal villages and nations that inhabited the areas of the southeastern quadrant of the United States prior to any contact with Europeans, who had maintained their ways of life at least 300 years after the year 1500. These nations were all forcibly removed and displaced from their homelands, but many were captured and sold into slavery. The reason the slave numbers skyrocketed during the early to mid 1800s is due to the wars that took place between the Indians and the colonialists, and the capture of Indians who were sold into slavery. The remaining 5 civilized tribes adopted European customs, forced out black members, and adopted slavery, and continued the practice for years after the Emancipation Proclamation. Andrew Jackson. Southern men idolized him. A rags to riches story. Given land in Nashville. Given a job as a lawyer. And pranced around Nashville with another man's wife. Oh, and by the way, is also responsible for the murder of black Indians. In the early 1850s, before signing the Emancipation Proclamation, Abraham Lincoln advocated for the colonization of slaves in Liberia and Central America. Slavery was not common among full-blooded tribes because they separated themselves from the ways of the European. These isolated pockets were not always considered part of the 5 civilized tribes. The 5 civilized tribes, of course, essentially supported the Confederacy and the institution of slavery. After the Emancipation Proclamation, former slaves were allowed to return to their tribes and become members of Cherokee Nation. The majority of these members were either emancipated slaves or were among the unlucky caravan who had been brutally driven west. During this process, the Indian nations were stripped of their communally held national lands, which was divided into single lots and allotted to individual members of the nation. The Dawes Commission required that individuals claim membership in only one tribe, although many people had more than one line of ancestry. Registration in the National Registry, known as the Dawes Rolls, has come to be critical in issues of Indian citizenship and land claims. Many people did not sign up on these rolls because they feared government persecution if their ethnicity was formally entered into the system. People often had mixed ancestry from several tribes. According to the Dawes Commission rules, a person who was 1/4 Cherokee and 1/4 Creek had to choose one nation and register simply as 1/4 Cherokee, for example. That forced individuals to lose part of his or her inheritance and heritage. Some would think that this still doesn't prove your ancestors are indigenous Americans, But once you understand the science behind DNA testing, you'll understand the business aspect of pushing certain agendas. Dr. Kittles, from African ancestry, fully admits that his results are less than 0.1% accurate, which is woefully low considering that these DNA tests are being pushed as an exact science, which in itself is a complete farce designed to get uneducated consumers to actually pay to submit their personal genetic information to research companies and big pharmaceutical companies. These companies in turn sell your genetic information on the open market to the highest bidder, which even includes government entities such as law enforcement agencies, which means now your DNA is in their database ready to be misused. These DNA tests are nothing more than an attempt by corporations to acquire free merchandise from medical companies who will use that information to create diseases and false cures that create more diseases through side effects, all while using your specific DNA to target certain populations. Do pharmaceutical companies cure disease or create disease? It's a hustle and everyone is in on it. The corporations, the police, the government, and even the so-called existing Indian tribes, which in many cases have no blood relation to actual tribal members, but have been given leadership roles within these communities. These recognized tribes are another stumbling block in the progression of true Native American history in this country. The remaining civilized tribes are not a representation of former indigenous tribes. The indigenous tribes were exterminated and disbanded in the 1800s, most effectively through the use of military force. Not all these people were driven into slavery, but a very significant number was. A common narrative in the United States is that all persons of copper complexion were slaves, which isn't true. However, even free black Indians were perpetual second-class citizens and only could operate on the margins of society. Slaveholding was a business strictly for wealthy whites, which were not the norm in the South. Only a small percentage of whites could even afford to have a slave. Surprisingly enough, the majority of slaves were owned by Jewish whites, who used the free labor to create a worldwide textile empire off the backs of slaves. These slaves, of course, were black Indians. Just as in the Virginia Slave Act of 1682 aimed to categorize Africans and Indians into the same classification, the Dawes Commission sought to strip full-blooded Indians, some mixed of different tribes, into one single tribe, Cherokee, the generic name given to several nations of Eastern indigenous people. Another paper genocide. By the year 1900, Africa had been raped by half of Europe, and the common thought among most people in America was that the Indians had been exterminated, and all black people came from Africa, an idea that had been pushed for over 200 years. In 1904, the first black Greek lettered organization was founded, Sigma Pi Phi. Its members included the most prominent blacks in the country. This organization is the predecessor to all black fraternities, Alpha Phi Alpha, Omega Psi Phi, and many others. These fraternities are branches of Prince Hall Freemasonry, which in itself is subservient to Grand Lodge European Freemasonry. These clandestine societies hold the keys to the secrets of this land, and they often use Native American symbolism in their art. The Oddfellows used symbolism commonly found in Mississippian art. This artifact was found in Tennessee. It predates any contact of Europeans to America. Even more suspiciously is that this artifact, which was found in Tennessee, clearly has some relationship with the Mayan culture. In Search of Lost Tribes, Native American Languages and Hebrew. Quote, from the 17th through the early 19th centuries, it was a commonly held belief that the Native Americans were descended from the lost 10 tribes of Israel. This view was not held only by many Christians, including Thomas Jefferson, but by many Jewish writers, such as Mordecai Noah as well, but fell out of favor by the early 19th century. One of the many reasons that scholars came to this conclusion was that it was quickly recognized that there was an apparent influence of Hebrew on Native American languages. It was noted that Native American languages often followed the Hebrew pattern of making prepositions into prefixes, and that Native American languages were similarly used prefixes and suffixes in much the same as Hebrew. In 1998, linguist Brian Stubbs published a revolutionary paper which demonstrated a distinct Hebrew influence on the Uto-Aztecan languages. Stubbs points out that cognate words in Hebrew and Uto-Aztecan, which share the same ambiguity, are especially compelling. Among the more compelling examples cited by Stubbs is the Uto-Aztecan word Yasipa, meaning sit or dwell, which appears related to the Hebrew root yashav, Strong's Concordance 3427, meaning sit or dwell. Stubbs gives many more examples, too numerous to list here. who were the Indians? So much effort has been used to push their history into oblivion. Why exhaust such means to deny a people of their true heritage? The history of these people goes much deeper than just being natives to this land. Their history is the biggest conspiracy of all time. And the heathen has labored tirelessly to hide the true identity of these Indians. But today, their identity shall be legitimately revealed before the world. History is a lie. Chronology is a lie. Today, history has proven to be a series of backdated accounts originating by the pen of the conqueror's most imaginative scribe. Ancient Rome, written into prosperity during a time in history when Europe was still unfamiliar with the concept of bathing and waste management, around which time is the earliest known manuscript of the Old Testament, while the newer books didn't surface until centuries later. Even astronomical dating puts the last books of the Old Testament, Ezra and Nehemiah, as late as the 15th century. The European colonization of the Americas is at the exact same time as the fall of Jerusalem. Those who seek to destroy us have casted the spell of ignorance that led our people straight into the chains of bondage. Shackled within those chains, the illustrious history of our world's greatest civilization. Concealed by the writings of pale-faced heathens scribing themselves into our past. Until one day we didn't recognize ourselves. And anytime we were reminded of who we were, we rejected the truth. For the comfort of those lies, that kept us in those chains. From the fear of the wrath taking place at night while we were still asleep. Afraid to wake up, hoping this cruel dream could not be a reality. But in reality, this was no dream.
Selling Harry.